Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition. Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney. Public sector unions in this country are under attack from right-wing, deep-pocketed organizations whose primary goal it is to eliminate collective bargaining. These attacks have already played out in states in Wisconsin and Michigan, and with cases in front of the Supreme Court, like Friedrichs versus the California Teachers Association, we have to sit up and take notice. I'm pleased tonight to introduce two members of the Cranston Teachers Alliance, Steve Blessington and John Santangelo. John is the Vice President of the Cranston Teachers Alliance. Welcome this evening.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, a couple of weeks ago you had the opportunity to have a conversation with the members of the Cranston Teachers Alliance to try and give them some information about the difference between a right-to-work state and a state where collective bargaining takes place. I'm not quite sure even today if all of your teachers, because I know most teachers really don't understand the difference. So I'd like to take some time using some of the footage from your presentation and this conversation to try and explain the difference between the two. Because I think some of the decisions that are going to take place in the Supreme Court and lower courts across the country are going to have an impact here. I think there are 30 other challenges in courts around the country that may even make it again to the Supreme Court. Let's talk briefly about the Friedrichs situation and the challenge by individuals in California. Tell me what they are, John. Tell me the background behind it.
I believe there's a teacher in California whose name has now been used to push this case forward. And basically it was she didn't want to have her money that she was paying, her dues that she was paying to her union, to support any political views that their organization may have had. So basically what it boils down to is if their union was supporting a candidate that supported the views of the union, or a legislator, anyone like that, she didn't believe that she wanted her union speaking on her behalf. So she was saying basically, I don't feel I should have to pay dues to that organization for them to speak on my behalf when I may not have the same views as that union.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Two things in particular. The first thing is that if people choose not to be a member of a union, not to be a member of the group that represent them at the negotiating table, should they have the benefits of that negotiation? And that brings into a second piece of discussion about agency fees. So let's just bring it back a little bit, because I think there's a big picture here about whether or not there's an attack on collective bargaining. So let's take a look in light of that conversation to talk about what's the difference between a state with collective bargaining and a right-to-work state. You both worked in North Carolina and Florida, and you were very clear to a group of teachers about what the difference is. Let's talk about the first thing, salary. What's the big difference? Steve, let me go to you first.
Well, coming from North Carolina, I had never been in a union. We had an association, North Carolina Association of Educators, but I never felt like they were fighting for me for anything. Working as a teacher in North Carolina, for 17 years, I was making my salary, and my wife and I were having trouble supporting our family. And she came up with the idea, why don't we move to Rhode Island? And I said, let's go. And when I got to Rhode Island, I was able to land a part-time position, 0.4 position, 4/10 of a full-time position. And I was making exactly the same that I was making in North Carolina after 17 years, working part-time in a school system in Rhode Island.
I think that's interesting, that kind of blatant variation exists. John, when you were talking to teachers, you were pretty clear that negotiations really were not negotiations in Florida. There were three
Right.
perspectives, and boards made decisions based on money. Had nothing to do with the idea of collective bargaining. Sounds like unions down there, I think at one point you said, were really there to try and represent the best interest of teachers. But collective bargaining was not something that was even in their wheelhouse.
Yeah, that's correct. What would happen is briefly, the teachers' union would put forth a proposal, and the superintendent's committee would also put forth a proposal. And obviously, they would be miles apart. So the school committee would order an arbitrator. An arbitrator, very pricey arbitrator, would come down from Tallahassee, and the union would be responsible for 50% of their stay. So that meant, because Florida's a big state, coming down from Tallahassee to Brevard County, which is in the center part of the state, it's where the Space Center is, meant having to put them up room and board for the whole length of the time the arbitration was taking place and so on. So it was a costly adventure. And then the arbitrator would then talk to both sides and come up with an arbitrated proposal as well. Now, in the state of Rhode Island, that arbitrated proposal is the one that would go before the school committee. In Florida, all three of those proposals would then go before the school committee.
So we know where they're going to go.
And exactly, and the school committee would then basically rubber stamp the superintendent committee proposal, because of course that would be the one that would pay the teachers the least and usually cut benefits and those kinds of things. So even though we had bargaining, we didn't have the ability to collectively bargain and then have an arbitrator come in and the arbitrated contract be the one that the bargaining unit as well as the school committee would then be voting on for acceptance.
I think in your presentation to teachers, I remember hearing you say you were there for 5 contracts, and every contract the arbitrator ruled in
correct.
favor of the superintendent's
Yeah,
proposal.
I spent 13 years teaching in Florida, and I was there for 5 contract negotiations, and yes, every single one of them, they ended up going with the superintendent's rubber-stamped approval of their contract, so of their proposal, I should say.
And I think, Steve, in particular, when I was looking at the information you had and what you were presenting, I found it unique that not only was your salary lower, but you were expected to do certain things, like I think you mentioned that your job came with a coaching position that paid $475 a year to drag students all over. Not that you wouldn't enjoy it, but you didn't have a choice.
No, no choice.
Tell me a little bit about that.
I was hired in '96, and they needed a head coach for soccer. So I was playing in high school. I said I could probably do that. So I got the job, started coaching, and I was making $425 for the season. Season went from August to November. Every day we practiced after school. We had 20 to 21 varsity games. And the first year I didn't have a bus license. So I had to ask teachers and other coaches to drive my team to our away games. And I think I had to do that for 2 years and got a little fed up having to do that. Puts the other teacher out, the other coach out. So I was kind of forced into my bus driver's license, and then I drove my team to our away games, coached them, drove them home, and they did pay for my license.
They did or didn't?
They did, $120, I think.
But think of that now. So you, in reality then, it wasn't just a matter of driving the bus. You assumed full responsibility as a teacher driving the bus with all of those students.
That's correct.
And in reality,
And I didn't know what that entailed at the time.
well, and I think,
Thank God nothing ever happened.
and I think oftentimes teachers don't understand the liabilities that exist within the teaching profession that they are protected from or supported in by unions. John, as a vice president in a union, you see situations every day where you advise teachers to do what puts them in the best situation, correct?
That's correct. And those teachers that you work with directly in those instances tend to have an awareness of what it is their union has done for them and how their union supports them. The teachers that haven't had to use some of those services are the ones that sometimes don't realize what is being done for them. You know, we call it kind of behind the scenes. There are things that go on all the time behind the scenes in order to make a teacher's experience in their profession a positive and rewarding one. And again, if you haven't had to call upon the union for some of the services that they award to people, it's difficult for them to understand exactly what it is their union is doing. But I would have to add that what's important there is, it's one of those, what you don't know means that there's something good going on out there, and that's the reason why you haven't had to confront any of these things. So the union is actually out there all the time supporting you in everything that you do, and in order to make your experience as a teacher, as a professional, a good positive one, and allows you to do the job that you got into this for, which is, you're trying to make an impression on students and advance students in their learning. And the union is there to help you make sure that you have what you need to accomplish that.
It's interesting, John, you talked about the kind of supportive services and professional development that would make teachers better in the classroom. And I can't help but think about the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and the supportive services, the professional development opportunities that they provide in making teachers or giving teachers the skills to be more effective in their classroom, whether it's classroom management or programs like You're the Guru in Thinking Math. Tell me about the importance that professional development and those supportive services play that the union has provided.
Well, our union here in Rhode Island has done a fantastic job. Our state fed, as well as our local district, has done a fantastic job of providing professional development. It's really important in the profession that we stay on top of the latest things coming down the road, and we do here in Rhode Island have our finger on that pulse, and that's a great thing. And they provide so many opportunities for us to have professional development. Where I taught before, when I was in Florida, professional development was there. We did have professional development. However, very rarely did you walk away from a professional development opportunity in Florida and feel as though you really enhanced your profession or your skill set as an educator. It was more about centered a lot around what the district was interested in having, and that wasn't necessarily with the students' best interest in mind. So it was always difficult for us to have the professional development at that time. Also down there, the professional development was not a requirement. So we had many people that either didn't participate at all. Those that did participate did so usually tongue-in-cheek. Down in Florida, they really don't help teachers become the best teachers they can be. And I think that's the main mantra of a teachers union, is to help teachers become the best teachers they can be. Because
so you see unions having two roles. There is the negotiation piece and the support piece, but professional development is a part of professional practice, and you see that. Steve, let me go to you. What was your experience in North Carolina in the area of professional development?
For the professional development, we were pretty much told you had to go to this professional development. We were there 5 days before kids arrived in the beginning of the school year, and those 5 days were always packed with professional developments. And like Jack said, it was usually something that benefited the system more so than it helped the teachers. And we didn't have any choice, you had to go. Tuesdays, you're at Williams from 8 to 2 or 8 to 3, your professional development.
And if I could just add into that, the other thing too that's really important, you heard Steve mention about the 5 days leading into the school year. That's important because that meant that though professional development was taking place within the realm of your normal work school year. And basically what that means is that clearly you need more than your school days to teach the kids in your contractual year. In the case of Florida, we had 196 days in our school year. So the students, of course, were in school 180 days. That left 16 additional days that we had to work beyond the student school year, and there was no added compensation for any of that. That was part of your contractual salary for the year, was to work those additional 16 days. Now, I thought that was terrible those extra 16 days. I can't speak for the other districts, but I know in Cranston we have 2. We work 182 days in Cranston. Till I met Stephen. And I discovered from talking to Stephen that in North Carolina you had,
Teachers, we would do 220 days.
in their school year, without any increase in your salary.
No.
But I think there's 2 issues here. One, there was no increase in salary, but it's about the quality of the professional development. You want that to have a positive impact on your instructional strategies in the classroom. Let's move away from that just for a moment. When we talk about what's happening, there is an issue around agency fees. And agency fees, from my understanding, really are the idea of having to separate out political activity from the servicing and implementation of any contract.
Correct.
What impact will that have on teachers?
In Rhode Island, minimal, very minimal. With the teachers union, with the RIFT teachers unions in Rhode Island, we separate what we call our PAC funds, which is our political action monies. We separate that out from our dues to begin with. So any member has the option of either contributing to the PAC fund or not. So those are already separated out. So in Rhode Island, it's not going to be much different between an agency fee total and a union dues total, because our political activity money is already separated out. So there may be a small percentage of a difference between the two, as there are a few things that go on over the course of the school year that don't get pulled from PAC money. But for the most part, it's going to be very, very close. So the way I see it, it's a very large risk that you take if you decide to go with the agency fee versus the union dues. Because though you may save a few dollars over the course of the year, the fact that you may have to be responsible for your own legal representation outside of the union really puts you at a high risk. In that, last time I checked, lawyers' fees are quite high. We're talking $300 to $400 an hour, and that obviously goes well beyond the small percentage of money that you'd be saving if you went with an agency fee over the union dues. So it really isn't beneficial to do that. But it's a place that, unfortunately, that we have to go, and that's why we have this campaign going on now about getting people to reaffirm with their unions and make that new pledge to their union that they're going to support the organization with union dues.
I suspect that there are many pieces of the contract that teachers have taken for granted and probably don't recognize. That issues around class size, that's a negotiated item. And when you begin to strip away contracts, when you begin to minimize the impact that organized labor being able to improve classroom instruction, being able to help determine class size. Having been a classroom teacher, I can't imagine being in class with 45 students, really expecting, here at the Institute, if we train in a program, we generally have cutoff numbers depending upon the content, the technology involved. That same thing has to apply in a classroom. There has to be some teacher-student ratio that improves the quality of instruction, rather than saying, you're going to have 45 students. What were your experiences in those states?
Well, my average class size when I was in Florida was usually around 40. We had teams. I taught at a middle school, and so we were using the teaming concept in middle school, and our entire team had generally around 160 to 170 students on the team. And if you keep in mind, there's 4 academic teachers on a team, so you have to take that number and divide it up by 4. Now, that's why I say around 40. Sometimes we went 45. It wasn't uncommon to occasionally approach 50. So we always had that going on. And let's go all the way down, though, to the brass tacks on this. Number one, there is absolutely nothing good about that for kids. And one thing that the unions always talk about first, and truly mean it, is that we do what we do in support of kids all the time. So the truth is that that's simply not a good formula for kids to learn. So when we try to go to the negotiating table and negotiate smaller class size, it's really done because we know, and the research shows, that students in smaller class sizes have an increased ability to learn that just simply doesn't happen when you have a ratio that's outrageous like a 40-to-1. So that's why we go to the table and we try to negotiate those kinds of things, like class size, like you mentioned. And there's a number of other things as well in a contract that has morphed over time into what we have today. And, you know, because we're now of the generation, my generation now in teaching is a generation that has benefited from the hard work that labor has put in years past. And unfortunately, though that's a great thing, unfortunately, it makes some of us almost take for granted what we currently have in our contracts. So this is almost like a let's get back to basics thing, and let's take a look at what it is we have in our contracts, why they're there, how it got there, and let's not forget those that fought to get it there. And it's difficult for some of us to do because we didn't have to live through that time. But there were educators before us that, you know, beat the pavement and did the door-to-doors and carried the signs and all that good stuff that we hear about unions. They did all that work so that our kids could be in the situations they're in now.
I mean, imagine if those things hadn't happened and a teacher was in a class of 40 to 45 students. A teacher didn't receive the professional development on classroom instruction and classroom management and programs that started with AFT many years ago on teaching teachers how to be more effective, like thinking math, and so many other programs. I think that it's absolutely critical for us, though, to talk about one central issue, and that's the issue of salaries. We know that teacher unions and contracts provided supportive services. But the brass tack on this particular piece is some of the discussion I heard you talk about in terms of salaries, in terms of steps, in I think it was Brevard County, and you said there are 25 steps, but in the last 3 steps, that's when you get most of your money.
North Carolina had the 25. Brevard we had 19 steps when I was there. And those 19 steps, though it sounds great, over the course of the 19 years was $19,000. Now, a logical person would say, well, they get a $1,000 a year raise each year. That's not the way it worked. The reality is you got $8,500 in step 18 and $8,000 in step 19. All the other steps below that were pennies, basically. You'd get a couple of $100 this year, $150 another year, $300 another year as you went up the steps. And the reality is in the state of Florida, there aren't many teachers that actually make it to step 18 and 19 for whatever reason, the main one being they realize that they can't support their family on this income, so they find alternate employment, whether it be moving out of state like I did, or whether it be, you know, maybe going into a different profession so that you can, you know, earn more money. So they were well aware of the fact that most educators in Florida never make it to that step 18, 19. So that's where they dumped all the money.
So they would almost take a look at it and say 2 things. They didn't encourage teachers to stay in the profession for a length of time. Right. But I think you also mentioned something about teachers being evaluated and being effective and highly effective. And the increases in salaries for effective and highly effective teachers. In Rhode Island, if I'm not mistaken, it was well over 90% of teachers were deemed to be effective or highly effective. When I take a look at the numbers of teachers that were deemed to be effective and highly effective in Florida, those numbers weren't high. There's got to be a correlation between that and how much they had to pay them in that particular
case. A direct correlation. This is a new thing now in Florida. This is since I've left, they've done this with the new teacher evaluation systems that have come through. What they've done now is we have 2 levels. The 2 upper levels are effective and highly effective. And what they did was they went in and they created as part of their contract these added bonuses. And I believe they were, off the top of my head, they were like, one of them the effective was like $3,500 and the highly effective was like $4,500. And you got that as a bonus tacked onto your yearly salary if you were deemed effective or highly effective. Now, the slippery slope here is that encourages evaluators to maybe not score someone fairly, because if they had too many effectives or highly effectives in their school, then that would increase their payroll significantly because of these stipends that they would get, these pay for performance bonuses that they would get. So it makes you wonder, what does that do to your morale? What does it do to your teaching ranks as far as, do you have a lot of teachers in your building now that are deemed, developing because they're afraid to put them over that notch to allow them to be effective as they probably truly are in order to save money, because it kind of reeks of corruption in there as far as the money tied to someone's profession is concerned, and that's a slippery slope. It's unfortunate, but that's a slippery slope.
So John and Steve, in conclusion to this part one in the series, I think it becomes evident that there's a very clear distinction between a right-to-work state and a state that recognizes collective bargaining. And we've touched on some of those things, but I do get concerned, and we'll talk about it in the next segment, when we talk about some people misunderstand a right-to-work state, and they think this is a great thing, when in reality, a right-to-work state does not recognize collective bargaining. You can go to work, but you may have to go to work for a much lower salary. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us in this first part of the segment. I hope you'll join us again in part two, and we'll talk soon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.